The rain hadn't come for weeks. In Ouagadougou, the dry season lingered like a ghost refusing to leave. Dust swept through the streets, clinging to windows, creeping into homes, and settling in the creases of every tired face. Inside a small compound guarded by silence and a lone Burkina flag, Ibrahim Traoré sat by an open window, a worn letter in his hands. The ink had smudged in places where sweat or tears, he wasn't sure which, had blurred the words. It wasn't an official communique. It was from a mother in Fata Ngorma. Her son had died in a village raid, and her voice on the page carried both fury and forgiveness. She had ended her note with just one question: will they ever see us as human? That question had haunted him. He was not born in a palace, nor raised on soft beds and whispered promises. He grew up in a Burkina Faso that taught him pain before it taught him language. He had seen men break from hunger, women bend under the weight of invisible wars, and children learn how to run from the sound of drones. In the academy, he kept his head down, not out of fear, but to avoid the gaze of those who believed their suits made them gods. They mocked his silence, confused his humility for weakness, but Ibrahim had learned to carry fire behind quiet eyes. The invitation from Moscow came wrapped in caution. It wasn't just a diplomatic affair. It was a chessboard, one where he was expected to play pawn, and he knew it. The world was watching, but the world did not know. They did not see what he carried into that meeting. They didn't see the letters, the funerals, the broken cradles he walked past in Dori. They didn't see the faces of orphaned boys who gripped wooden sticks as rifles, because their real ones had been taken by men who looked like them but served a god called Prophet. Still, he went. The jet was quiet. As it sliced through clouds and silence, he stared at the horizon like it might offer answers. His security detail murmured behind him, uncertain of what the Kremlin would hold. Would it be condescension in polished marble? Or another theater of masks and mirrors? He didn't know. But he wasn't going to Moscow for validation. He was going for something older, something buried deep inside him since the first time he saw his people bury hope. He carried no speeches, no entourage of sycophants, just a mind sharpened by history and a heart armored with sorrow. He remembered the night before he left, when a girl no older than 8 ran up to him on the street, barefoot, her smile wide despite the ruin around her. "Tell them we're not animals," she said before vanishing into the crowd. He would carry her voice into the lion's mouth when the plane touched down. The cold kissed his skin with a reminder this was not home. This was the land of old powers, of deals inked in the blood of forgotten continents. Cameras flashed. Suits approached. Polite, practiced smiles. Putin's team extended the welcome. But Traoré wasn't looking for hospitality. He was searching for something behind their eyes, curiosity, perhaps. Or caution. They had expected a child of chaos, a rebel in a commander's uniform. What they saw instead was a man who walked like still water but burned like oil beneath the surface. The initial moments were stiff. Formalities stretched long. Translated and retranslated into the language of global theater. But when the doors finally closed and the world outside faded, Traoré and Putin sat across from each other in a room so silent it made truth louder. Putin's eyes scanned him like a riddle, but Ibrahim did not blink. What no one saw, what no cameras captured, was the weight in that room. A young African leader, whose country had been carved and traded like a loaf of bread, staring into the face of a man who had made kings kneel and borders bend. The room held decades of colonial blood, Cold War echoes, and the quiet hum of empires reconfiguring, and there, in that strange silence, Traoré did something no one expected. He told a story, not about politics, not about military alliances, not even about gold. He told Putin about a boy named Kudugu who died trying to protect his village with nothing but a rusted machete. A boy who wanted to be a teacher, who read borrowed books by candlelight until one day, men came and fire swallowed his dreams. He told it simply, with no theatrics. Just truth. Putin leaned forward, and for a moment the air changed. No aides, no interpreters, no applause. Just two men, bound by different worlds, but suddenly united by the cost of war and the price of forgotten lives. The room had no applause. No reporters scribbling, no flashes of cameras interrupting emotion. But within those four walls, something sacred passed between them. Not friendship, not alliance, something deeper. A recognition. The kind you feel in the eyes of someone who has walked through fire and sees the burn marks in you. Putin spoke next, not with the sharp calculation many feared, but with the wariness of a man who had held too many countries on his back and watched too many crumble in his hands. His voice was not warm, but neither was it ice. He spoke of power, of responsibility, of the price men pay to protect a homeland. Yet even then, Traoré did not flinch. He had heard all this before, in different accents, from different mouths. Power always came wrapped in the language of duty. But behind that always was a shadow. I do not come here, Traoré said softly, to kneel. I come only to remember the children. Putin said nothing, but something in his posture shifted. A brief silence followed. Not awkward, heavy, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Traoré reached into his coat and placed a small wooden carving on the table. It was rough, hand-carved, the shape imperfect but unmistakable, a mother shielding her child. This is from a widow in Tapoa. She lost everything but this piece. She told me to give it to the man who could understand why silence is more dangerous than war. There was no reply. Only stillness. The Russian aides re-entered, their chatter disrupting. The air like glass shattering on tile. The conversation shifted back to formalities, to pipelines and military aid, to trade routes and logistics. But for Traoré, the real conversation had already happened. The rest was theater. He nodded at all the right times, spoke when necessary. But his mind was elsewhere, back in the streets of Ouagadougou, in the dust and song of his people. He didn't need the Kremlin's permission to lead them. He came for something else. He came for dignity, later that evening. After the meetings ended, Traoré stood alone on the balcony of his hotel. The Moscow skyline glittered below, indifferent. And immense, snow began to fall, gentle and uncaring. He watched it settle on the ledge and melt slowly. That quiet decay reminded him of the slow erasure of truth across continents. Behind him, one of his aides entered. "Sir, tomorrow's press conference." Traoré raised a hand. "Do you hear it?" he asked. "Hear what?" "The sound of us disappearing." The aide didn't understand, but said nothing, and then something extraordinary happened. A young Russian staffer approached quietly from the shadows of the hallway. She had been translating part of the meeting. Her eyes were wide, hesitant. In her trembling hands, she held the wooden carving. I shouldn't do this," she said in broken French. But this moved him. Traoré looked at her, not surprised. Moved him how? He didn't say. But he held it for a long time, longer than anything else. She left it with him and bowed. As she walked away, he called to her gently. "Do you know why that piece matters?" She shook her head. "Because it is broken, and it is still beautiful." He turned away, holding the carving with fingers that trembled, not from the cold, but from something deeper. A memory, a storm rising in the chest. He didn't sleep that night. He sat near the window, watching the snowfall gather slowly like forgotten prayers. Every so often, he thought of the boy with the machete, the girl with the barefoot smile, the mother who carved sorrow into wood. They were with him. He wasn't alone in this city of giants and shadows, and just before dawn, as the skyline began to blur with gray, Traoré scribbled something into a small notebook. A single line: "If the world will not remember us, we must become unforgettable." Let that be the legacy. Let that be the roar beneath the silence. And let every viewer reading this now pause and comment one powerful phrase, not just to honor him, but to remind themselves, we are broken and still beautiful. He carried those words back into the next day like armor, because this was not just diplomacy. It was defiance. The official broadcast of the summit showed little more than handshakes. Flags, phrases crafted by political poets. Cameras captured what the world wanted to see: two leaders exchanging. pleasantries, walking tightropes between sovereignty and strategy. But the cameras were not allowed in the quiet room behind the ceremony. The one with no microphones, no scripts, no shields. That room was smaller, no gold-lined walls. Just a circular table, a thick carpet, and the exhaustion of real men buried beneath titles. Traoré was early. He stood by the window again. But this time the view looked down into a courtyard of ice and silence. He could feel the ghosts of decisions made here before him. Treaties signed with ink still dripping from the wounds of smaller nations. It felt heavy, not with fear, but with clarity. He wasn't supposed to win this game. He was too young, too African, too willing to speak plainly in a world built on rehearsed ambiguity. He wasn't backed by a superpower or funded by foreign banks. What he carried wasn't briefed, it was lived. When Putin entered, the room did not shift. It stayed still. Two figures in a world that preferred puppets to people. Putin gestured for him to sit. He did. There were no translators this time. Just short, broken English and the ancient language of intention. You came for what? Putin asked quietly. Traoré looked at him, eyes unflinching. For something you used to believe in. A pause. Which is? Sovereignty that is not for sale. It wasn't defiance, it was truth. The kind that does not require volume to be heard. Putin's mouth didn't move, but something flickered in his stare, a recognition, perhaps, or a memory of his own rebellion in another lifetime. They talked. Long after the aides expected them to stop, the conversation wandered. From Wagner's role in Africa to the weight of colonized maps. From the fragility of young democracies to the ghost of Thomas Sankara. And then the moment came. It was Putin who asked it, quietly, almost as if to himself. Why do you resist so hard, knowing how much easier it is to obey? Traoré didn't answer immediately. He folded his hands, looked down at his fingers, calloused from years of holding weapons and writing reports by candlelight. Then he said, because when I was 9, I saw a man kneel for a bag of rice, and I swore I never would. The words landed not like a punch but like a whisper echoing down a well. There was no reply. Only the sound of the radiator clicking like a tired heartbeat trying to keep pace. When the meeting ended, Traoré rose, bowed slightly and prepared to leave. But before he turned the knob on the door, Putin spoke again. Your people will suffer more for this choice. Traoré stopped. Yes, he replied, but they will suffer standing up. There were no applause, no headlines about that moment. But somewhere in the folds of that encounter, history shifted. A seed planted not in soil but in will, outside. Reporters waited with umbrellas and microphones, hungry for sound bites. Traoré gave them none. He walked through the snowfall like a man who had just buried something sacred in illusion. A dependence, a fear. That night he sat again with the carving, turned it over in his hands like a relic. He thought of the girl again. Tell them we're not animals. The echo of her voice filled the space between his breath and the silence. He didn't cry, but something inside him softened, not out of weakness, out of the kind of strength that knows grief is part of leadership. He opened the notebook again, wrote below his first line, we are broken and still beautiful. Let that be the banner, let that be the pulse, let that be what they write on walls when the statues fall. And if you're watching this, if you feel even an ember of that fire inside your chest, then type it into the void so it echoes beyond this screen. We are broken and still beautiful, because this wasn't just a summit. It was the beginning of a war fought with dignity. Instead of drones, the formalities were over. The flights scheduled, the interviews declined, the cameras were gone, the microphones unplugged, the world moving on as it always did, fast, forgetful, fixated on the next spectacle. But Ibrahim Traoré remained. One final evening in Moscow, one final walk beneath foreign skies that did not know his name or his burden. He refused the convoy. He asked for no guards, just a coat, gloves, and space to breathe. The snow was thicker now, falling in quiet waves like forgotten prayers. The streets were quieter at night. The statues of Russian heroes stood unmoved by time, their faces carved into permanence. He looked up at them, wondering how many of them had bled for what they believed, and how many had traded souls for survival. He walked for nearly an hour, past the grand avenues, past the cafes that buzzed with warmth and language he couldn't understand, past the eyes that followed him curiously, some with suspicion, others with indifference. It didn't bother him. He wasn't here to be understood. He turned into a side street and found himself in front of a bookstore. The lights were low, the shelves lined with stories written in Cyrillic, unreadable yet somehow familiar. Inside, an old man swept the floor, pausing only to glance at him through the glass. There was no welcome, no hostility. Just a shared moment, two strangers suspended in a world of words and snow. He thought of his father then. A farmer, a man of very few words but hands that held truth. He had once told Ibrahim, as they buried a goat struck by lightning, that strength was not what you carried, but what you refused to lay down even when the world asked you to. That line returned to him now, clear, defiant. He sat on a bench nearby, snow dusting his shoulders, cold sinking into his boots. He watched people pass without knowing they were walking by a man who had turned down deals that could have bought him a lifetime of luxury. He remembered every offer that had come with a smile and a chain, and he had said no, over and over. Not because he enjoyed sacrifice, but because something in him would not bend. What haunted him most was not the enemy outside, but the doubts within. He had trusted men who later sold maps of his strategy for a suitcase of dollars. He had opened his door to advisors who reported to distant capitals. Even now, back in Ouagadougou, there were whispers. Those who smiled in the daylight but rehearsed betrayal at night. Sometimes, it made him wonder if leadership was just another word for loneliness. His phone buzzed. A message from one of his generals. Another village burned in the east. Another ambush. Another child among the dead. He closed his eyes. The snow kept falling, and somewhere, quietly, a tear escaped the fortress of his resolve. It wasn't weakness. It was memory. He thought of the boy with the machete, the barefoot girl, the widow. With the carving, they were not statistics. They were his compass. They were the soil in which his resolve was planted. He wiped his face, stood, and pulled the carving from his coat. He held it high just for a second, letting the falling snow kiss its surface. And for the third time, he whispered not to the night, not to the snow, but to the millions watching his story unfold across screens and continents. We are broken and still beautiful. If you are watching, carry those words in your heart. Speak them into your own silence. Let them break the lie that suffering erases worth. He placed the carving gently on the bench and walked away. Some would see it as a simple gesture, but in truth it was a seed. Maybe someday, a stranger would find it, lift it into their hands, and understand, not with the mind, but with the marrow, that this journey was never about politics. It was about reclaiming something no colonizer, no mercenary, no empire could steal. Dignity. Traoré or Yakut didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, but because his soul was awake. There are moments when history is written not with ink, but with footsteps in the snow. This was one of them. The runway in Ouagadougou was dry and cracked, just as he remembered it. Dust rose like memory around the tires of the landing jet. There were no grand receptions waiting for him. No drums, no press, no orchestrated embraces. Just the scent of red earth and the sun hanging low like a watchful elder in the sky. It was home, scarred, resilient, waiting. Ibrahim Traoré stepped out of the plane in silence, the wooden carving wrapped in cloth and held close to his chest. He breathed in the heavy air as if to remind his lungs of who he was, no matter what. He had discussed behind closed doors with men who ruled empires. This was the soil that made him. These were the people who gave him the right to speak on their behalf. And now, they waited not for answers but for action. The drive back to the capital was long. Children waved from the roadside. Farmers paused from their work, raising calloused hands in recognition, not reverence. Some still didn't trust him. Others had made him a symbol. Neither comforted him. He wasn't seeking to be a symbol. He was trying not to drown in the weight of what leadership really meant. Back at the presidential compound, the night fell fast. The team buzzed with debriefs and post-meeting assessments. Strategists parsed every sentence, searching for political leverage, but Traoré listened little. He sat alone in his office, lights dimmed, reading again the old letter from the mother. Infada Negorma. Her son, the one buried without a name on the headstone? Her question still rang loud. Will they ever see us as human? He thought of how Putin had looked at him, not as a junior player on a chessboard, but as a man. Man with something dangerous inside him, conviction. And perhaps that was what frightened them all most. Not weapons, not armies, but the kind of belief that could not be bought. In the days that followed, the carving sat on his desk, a reminder of Moscow's silence and the snow that never stopped falling. He didn't speak much about the meeting publicly. There was nothing to boast about. Real power wasn't in declarations. It was in decisions. He began making quiet changes, refusing offers that came with veiled chains, reorganizing systems that had long rotted from within, lifting young commanders from the villages, not the cities, sending more aid to regions forgotten by maps drawn in Paris or Washington. Slowly, the country began to feel it, not a revolution with drums and fire, but a reawakening. One morning, during a village visit in the north, he met an old woman seated under a neem tree, selling roasted groundnuts. Her back was bent with time, but her eyes were still sharp. She didn't rise when he approached. She didn't smile. She just looked at him and said, "Did you tell them?" He didn't need to ask what she meant. "Yes," he said. "I told them." She nodded. "Good, now tell us." That evening, he stood in front of a small crowd. No podium, no cameras, just people with sunburned skin and stories in their wrinkles. And he spoke, not of alliances, not of resources, but of the boy with the machete, the barefoot girl, the mother who carved sorrow into something sacred. And he told them softly that in a room full of giants, he did not kneel. He said, "They asked me why I fight. I told them because I saw a man kneel for a bag of rice and I swore I never would." Silence followed, a silence that said, "We remember too." As he left, a young boy ran up and handed him a small drawing, crude, done in charcoal on a torn page. It showed Traoré holding the carving in one hand and a book in the other. The boy had written something below it, not in perfect grammar, not even in full sentences, but in something far more powerful. "We are broken and still beautiful." That night, back in his room, Ibrahim placed the drawing beside the carving and stared at them both. A line formed in his mind. Not a slogan, not a policy, a prayer. Let us build something that cannot be erased. And he knew in that quiet moment, when no one was watching, that this was not the end of his journey. It was only the end of the beginning, for real power is not the seat you occupy. It is the silence you endure, the dignity you protect, and the brokenness you carry with grace. So to you watching now, if your heart has ever been shattered, if the world has overlooked your worth, if you have fought to be seen and still feel invisible, remember this: you are broken and still beautiful. That is not your weakness, that is your crown.